Welcome back to another episode of Miller's Movers. We're rapidly now heading towards the Cheltenham Festival, having got Cheltenham Trials Day out the way, Dublin Racing Festival this weekend. So the talk will start to ramp up a little bit more around the Cheltenham Festival with some selections. This week, I'm going to take a look at the Champion Hurdle and the Champion Chase. But first, we ought to catch up of the news of the weekend and the breaking news this morning, actually, that the jukebox man, well fancied for the Browns advisory, is going to miss the rest of the season. Incurred injury in routine work at home, which will require him to take some time off. They're hoping they'll have him back from the autumn. This is going to be the story now from here on in. It's, as they would say, squeaky bum time. Trainers checking legs in the evening and again in the morning and hoping that nothing comes to light. And there's bound to be, sadly, a few more that will almost certainly miss the festival. It's just that time of the year where work gets ramped up, a little bit more pressure gets applied. The cumulative effect of runs through the season can start to take its toll as well. So I don't think Jukebox Man will be the last horse, and it's a real shame we missed him because I thought he was a really exciting novice chaser. It's been keen to see if he could go one better than the Albert Bartlett second last year over fences. He's looked a natural, so it is a big miss, but hopefully he'll be back next season. The weekend really focused around Cheltenham and the Cheltenham Trials Day. I often think that the trials part of that naming is a little bit misguided because it often isn't the case. But I think this year that's perhaps a bit more true. The JCB Triumph Trial won by East India Doc in really good fashion. He's progressed with every run. I mean, he looked useful when winning at Wincanton, but he certainly didn't look special. Then went to Cheltenham last time and won very nicely and backed that up again with a really effortless performance here. He's a slick jumper. He looks like a natural hurdler. He's still got plenty of pace. He's a good flat horse and he stays very well. I mean, he stayed 2 miles on the flat. So the ground conditions will not be an issue to him come March. If he comes up testing, that's not going to inhibit him. He's also got a little bit of natural pace. Lulamba clearly is a very smart horse. He won on his debut at Kempton, but I don't think he's going to get it all his own way. I think East India Doc, like I mentioned after Lulamba's win, was perhaps going a little bit under the radar because of recency bias. Well, that's not the case anymore. He's reminded everyone exactly what he can do. James Owen can clearly prepare these horses very well, and I think it's shaping up to be a decent Triumph Hurdle with, of course, the prospect that Willie Mullins or someone in Ireland could unearth a decent juvenile at Dublin Racing Festival this weekend. The Cotswold Chase, this wasn't a Gold Cup trial. Alon Presse beat Stage Star. Stage Star bounced back to something like his best up in trip to this 3-mile trip. He looked far more comfortable, travelled with a bit more zest and jumped pretty well. Alon Presse fiddled a few fences, but he was well on top at the end. Yes, he only won by a short margin, but I think that was down to Charlie Deutsch being very conservative with the fuel. Clearly, he's been a difficult horse to train. He's obviously hard to keep sound, and Charlie Deutsch was at pains not to put any more pressure on this horse than was required to get the job done. He's entitled to go back to the Gold Cup. He ran a very fine race last year, and I think he'll do again this year. Whether they had a slightly better prep this year, last year it was a bit of a checkered prep coming in. This year's been a little bit smoother. He might be able to go a little bit better, perhaps hit the frame and get a little bit closer to Galloping de Champs and the like. But I think he looks an unlikely winner, but he's a really likeable horse. Charlie Deutsch rides him very well. And we should also point out that this was a chance for Venetia Williams to bounce back into form. She's 5 winners now, 17% strike rate. She's starting to turn the tide around, having had a really good November and December. January was very poor, but just at the back end of January, starting to come along quite nicely now. So Lon Presse, he'll go to the Gold Cup. Stage Star, he's going to go to Aintree. Flat track will perhaps suit him better, but I don't think he's an out-and-out top-class 3-miler. The Cleve Hurdle, again, a slightly disappointing heat with a view to it being a trial for the Stayers Hurdle, for all that these might take a part in the Stayers division, because it is a pretty weak division, as we've mentioned a few times. Gower Road came on top. I think it'd be a pretty stone-hearted person to begrudge him a win. He's run really well for about the last 2 seasons, but bumped into a horse each time. This, I think, was his Gold Cup, to coin the phrase. He was well ridden by Sam Tristan Davis, had a little bit more pace up the hill than Monmorel. I was pretty hopeful for my shot for some way. Botox has put him up on the Thursday podcast. I thought the ground was going to ride slower, and when it hadn't, he was quite a drifter on the day. He went out to a big double-figure price, but he ran well. And I wouldn't perhaps be sleeping on him completely if we got a soft ground festival in the Stayers Hurdle, because I do think that's a very weak division. But we should point out that the win of Gower Road played a handsome compliment to Lucky Place, who beat him last time, albeit over a shorter trip. Lucky Place is perhaps the progressive horse in the Stayers Hurdle picture. The novice hurdle was won by 6 Mile Bridge, who downed Potter's Charm. And I think 6 Mile Bridge perhaps didn't get his just rewards here, because much of the focus was on the fact that Potter's Charm lost his unbeaten record over hurdles. But 6 Mile Bridge, you might remember we interviewed Keelan Woods last year before the Cheltenham Festival. He was pretty excited about 6 Mile Bridge going into the festival bumper. He'd won at Sandown on his debut and was reported to not be entirely healthy. He'd scoped far from clean on that occasion. So Keelan was quite hopeful that the Cheltenham Festival bumper would suit him well. He boiled over in the preliminaries before that. He ran no sort of race at all, having done far too much in the early stages. He's looking a more relaxed horse now with Fergal O'Brien. Stayed this trip well. I don't think he's likely winner of the Turners hurdle, but I wouldn't just be completely certain that Potter's Charm would get the better of him again. Potter's Charm, I think Tristan Davis will be really kicking themselves that they came for this. After the Formby win at Aintree over Christmas, they said they would freshen him up, go straight to Cheltenham. I think they thought that maybe a little decent pot here might be theirs for the taking. They went there clearly not fully wound up and they've paid the price, and it might cost them. This is going to be now his 6th run going into the festival. The Turners will be his 6th run. He's run pretty hard all season, and it's going to be a pretty big job to freshen him up because he had quite a hard race in defeat, I felt, because Sam Twist Davis was obliged to go and try and win the race from a fairly uncompromising position. He's going to have a tough race. They're going to have to freshen him up and put a bit of fitness on him. That's not an easy job to do. And I just wonder whether they might have lost the chance of getting a Cheltenham Festival winner behind them with this. Of course, the feature race of the day and the star on show was Constitution Hill, who had a nice cant around in the international hurdle to win fairly easily. Gave everyone a heart attack at the last when there was a pretty big miscommunication between Nico de Boinville and himself. You will remember that when he won the champion hurdle, there was a miscommunication on that occasion. Nico thought he'd go in and pop, and Constitution Hill decided to take a flyer. On this occasion, Nico thought they'd take a flyer, and Constitution Hill decided to go in and pop. The amusement there is plain for all to see. But he got away with it. He stood up and he get back, straight back on the bridle, cantered home. Barely did a piece of work, according to Nico on top. I like the fact that afterwards, Nicky Henson in his interview said that Nico said he'd have to come in and ride him on Sunday because he simply hadn't done enough and was too fresh. I mean, that's obviously tongue-in-cheek. There's absolutely no chance at all that Constitution Hill was worked on Sunday, but it really shows they're clearly very happy with this horse's health heading into the season. I like that Nicky Henson has really come out swinging this season. He's been a little bit more adventurous with his running of the horses. He's clearly keen to put that. So Constitution Hill winning the international hurdle probably brings us nicely into the champion hurdle and the champion chase picture, and where I think the winners might come from in these two races. They perhaps lack a little bit of depth and competitiveness. There's two fairly short-priced favourites, both trained by Nicky Henson. In the champion hurdle, Constitution Hill, well, he's the standout. He's rated 175. He won it 2 years ago. He was absent last year after that fairly poor spring with the health of Nicky Henson's yard. And it's a case really of whether you believe him to be back to his best. And in truth, I don't think you'll really know until you see him go into the red at Cheltenham in the Champion Hurdle, if indeed he has to go into the red to beat these rivals. But everything he's done this year, I think, has been a positive. He won the Christmas hurdle off a fairly troubled prep because he was lame after that gallop at Newbury. He got that done. He saw off Lossy Mouth for all that might not have been her track. And then he clearly really pleased them coming out to that race at Christmas. There was talk that he would go straight to the Cheltenham Festival. I think many people thought that would be Nicky Henson's MO. He doesn't run them if he doesn't feel he needs to, but they've clearly been very happy with him. They ran him in the international. He looked good again there. He hurdled slickly. He travelled with real zest. He's clearly still got his appetite for the game, and I think there's every chance that he's capable of running to his mark of 175 again come the Cheltenham Festival. The two mares are probably his biggest rivals, if indeed they turn up. I think Lossymouth is pretty certain to go to the Cheltenham Champion Hurdle and avoid the Mares Hurdle, because they've said this is a 2-year plan to go from the Triumph to the Mares and then go and have a tilt at the Champion Hurdle. Yes, they would have been more confident if she'd have got the better of Constitution Hill at Kempton, but I think in hindsight, perhaps that wasn't her track. She was pretty flat to the boards early. Cheltenham really is her track. She's won the Triumph Hurdle, she's won the International Hurdle last year, and she won the Mares Hurdle every time in pretty impressive fashion. So the track's going to hold no fears for her, but she will be on the old course, slightly sharper. That will demand a little bit more speed. And then brighter days ahead. Very difficult to know what they're going to do with her. They're telling us they're going to go to the Mares Hurdle, and I've said before that Gigginstown often state that for them it is just about having a win at Cheltenham. If there was a Cheltenham seller, they would have plenty of runners in it and they would be happy to go and win that. So I wouldn't get too carried away by the fact that the Champion Hurdle is a better, more prestigious race. They will just want to win her, and I do still think that come the day she'll end up in the Mares Hurdle and we won't see her against Constitution Hill. If she does, she's rated 163. And she gets £7 mare's allowance. That puts her up to around about 170. But she would just have to go improve that run from Leopardstown over Christmas when State Man, badly disappointed Winterfog, was back in second. is a genuine piece of form. I'm just not quite so sure. And you would also just have to point out that she did struggle for a little bit of pace in the Mares Hurdle last year, Mares Novice Hurdle last year when beaten. So I think this is all about Constitution Hill. I think he's the one they've got to beat. State Man, he doesn't look quite what he was, and we know that Constitution Hill is a better horse than him. And then Amsterdam, he was impressive at the weekend, but again, it was a fairly moderate affair. And it seems like Willie Mullins is suggesting that maybe he doesn't want to send him to a champion hurdle as a 5-year-old, and they might wait, perhaps go to Liverpool or Fairyhouse later in the year, and then bring him back potentially over fences next year. So Constitution Hill is the one for me. Whether you want to go and back him at a short price this far out, I'm not quite so sure. Into the champion chase, and again, Nicky Henson's got the leader in the market here in John Bon. He's a horse that divides opinion. I'm firmly in the John Bon camp. I did waver last season. I wondered whether he's becoming a little bit disappointing, but for me, the key to this horse is Nico de Boinville. Again, a jockey that divides opinion. I personally think he's one of the finest riders in the country because jumps racing is about jumping, and he's very, very good to an obstacle, very positive when he needs to be. He clearly understands John Bon well. He's yet to taste defeat on him. I thought his run in the Tingle Creek was very good. Thought the run in the Clouds House was excellent, and he had a nice canter around the Schlur Chase when clearly not fully wound up. There's some talk that Cheltenham's not his track. I just don't buy that at all. He bumped into Constitution Hill in the Supreme Novices Hurdle. He was then behind Al Fabiolo, who was a fearsome novice chaser when beating the Arkle. And again, I'm not sure they got their tactics right on that occasion. I would like to have seen him ridden more prominently and made Al Fabiolo come past him. So I do think he's the one he's got to beat. Yes, he's got to get there. He's versatile with regards to ground. And then what is in against him? Gaelic Warrior. Well, I was keen on him last year. You might remember that some way out, I thought the Arkle would be his target. I thought he was 2 mile. I thought he would jump straighter on a left-handed track over 2 miles, and he did. And he won the Arkle, but you would have to say that form has not really worked out. Founder 50 has been found wanting in open grade this season. Gaelic Warrior has beaten on his return at Leopardstown for all that he probably would step forward for that, and Leopardstown might not be his track. Soft ground is probably going to be the key to him. The softer the ground gets, the more the gap between him and John Bon narrows. But he's rated 165. He has got £5 to find with John Bon, and John Bon runs consistently to a mark of 170, whereas Gaelic Warrior can be a bit in and out. So I'd be happy to take John Bon over him. Ile Francais is probably the lurker in the field if they send him here. He's got entries in the Champion Chase, the Ryanair, and the Gold Cup. I think if they go to Cheltenham, it will be for the Champion Chase. I don't think they'd be too fussed about winning the Ryanair, and I think they would have to concede that he probably hasn't got the stamina for a Gold Cup. It's just with Ile Francais whether he can get loose on the front and get that easy lead that clearly serves him so well. He is a pacey horse, but he's a pacey horse against 3 milers. Whether he's going to look quite so pacey against genuine 2 milers, I'm not so sure. And I'm just not certain that Cheltenham is his track. He tends to jump very long, very low, very flat, and jump a long way out to the back of the fence. He's not going to want to do that at a couple of downhill fences at Cheltenham. So for all I can see the appeal of Ile Francais at a price, I do think that perhaps Cheltenham is not his track, and he'd be better served waiting, being a bit patient and going to entry. And then we should mention Al Fabiolo, the horse that's beaten John Bon over fences in the Arkle. He ran badly in the Champion Chase last year, made a bad mistake at the fence away from the stands, was pulled up pretty quickly afterwards, and then returned, perhaps rushed back to run at Sandown, beaten behind John Bon. John Bon was well on top there by 4 lengths, but I don't think that's the real El Fabiolo. He was perhaps just rushed back after that bad mistake at Cheltenham, which I'm sure caused a little bit of muscle damage. But it's worrying that we've not been seen since. And Anthony Bromley, racing manager for Isaac Swade and Simon Near, has said that he's getting the vibes that he might not appear at the Dublin Racing Festival. It's clearly been heavy work trying to get him fit this season. So you couldn't really fancy him with any real conviction. Because if he doesn't come out this weekend, it's going to be pretty tight then to get a prep run into him before the Cheltenham Festival. And I certainly would be keen to oppose him if he arrived at the Cheltenham Festival without a prep race. So with regards to the Champion Hurdle and the Champion Chase, I wouldn't want to take either John Bon or Constitution at a short price, but if you put them into a double, which SPK would boost to 5-1, I do think that's a little bit more appealing. Of course, you have to factor in that Constitution Hill has shown a tendency to be slightly fragile, but I caveat that by saying that Nicky Henson is clearly very happy indeed with this horse's health, feels that he's gotten back to his best, feels that he's getting a clean run with him finally. I think they'll both go off shorter on the day. So for me, the 5-1 double, if I had to have a bet at this stage, would appeal most. Before we get into handicap moves and shakers, I did think it was worth passing comment on the breaking news from the weekend that the PRA, who represent, so they say, 170 trainers, are starting to demand that trainers be compensated financially for interviews given to media both before and after racing. I think it's important to clear up a few things. This is not going to be trainers wandering around with a wallet that you can put cash in, or indeed a wireless cash machine, but it's going to go into a central fund. But Peter Saville, in an interview, wasn't particularly clear what that central fund would be for. He said it would be for maybe a trainers benevolent fund or a trainers insurance fund. Jockeys do get paid for their interviews, but that money goes into a central fund for a jockeys insurance scheme. That's clearly well marked, and I think you would have to concede that when it comes to taking risk, jockeys are taking far more risk day to day than trainers are. There's an ambulance travelling around behind them, so a jockeys insurance scheme seems like money well spent. There's clearly a big division in the ranks at the moment that the trainers and the horseman group in general feel that not enough money is being shared out from the media rights. And I think there's an argument to agree with that, but it seems like a very fragmented argument to start demanding money for interviews when prize money is so poor at the moment. I would far rather see the argument from the PRA and the horsemen's group be about increasing prize money, reducing the racing calendar to create some more competitive racing, maybe having a day in the week where there is no jumps racing. I don't think that would be a bad thing. It doesn't seem to harm Irish racing, and simply demanding that trainers get paid for interviews seems to me to be a very wide of the mark sort of suggestion, and it certainly hasn't gained any great following from the public, largely due to, I think, the fact that racing public feel that the trainers aren't all that forthcoming in interviews, can be a little bit boring. You tend to get stock answers. We're very happy with how he's trained. We're excited to see what he can do. Whatever he does here, he'll step forward. They tend to be much of a muchness. They're suggested that they might boycott giving interviews at Sandown this weekend, and I'm happy with that. I think the interviewers there can do a better job. Go and seek out the lads and lasses that lead up these horses, the owners that have paid for these horses all the way through. In some cases, owner breeders who know far more about the horse than the actual trainer does. So I'd be quite happy to get the views of some other people this weekend. And if it does come to pass that trainers get paid for interviews, then I think we have to expect our interviewers to do a better job and ask far tougher questions. I think so often poor decisions made by trainers, poor decisions made by jockeys as to running plans and choices of races that are targeted are sort of let slide because interviewers are reliant on the goodwill of trainers to speak to them. But if they're getting paid for it, we don't need to rely on the goodwill. In football, you've had recently Ange Postecoglou being asked, well, it's the same old story, isn't it, Ange? And he sort of was a bit taken aback. Said, well, you've been beaten again. I mean, that's a fairly tough line of questioning. Of course, we had Roy Hodgson all those years ago saying that he felt the interviewer was taking the piss. I would like to see that. I would like to see trainers held accountable a little bit more. Why have you run here? Are you disappointed that you've spent all this money on horse X and he's failing to deliver on what you said he was bought to do? So I think trainers have to be very careful. They can't have it both ways. They can't get an easy ride from interviewers and at the same time get money from a racing media group. Into Handicap Movers and Shakers now, and to start with, we have to go back to the Sunday of the Windsor Winter Millions weekend. The first one I want to talk about is Jinko Blue, Nicky Henson, Nico de Boinville. He won the Grade 2 3-mile chase. I say a Grade 2, it probably wasn't a deep Grade 2, but the runner-up Lowry's Bar is a decent yardstick, and I think he improved for the 3-mile trip. Jinko Blue didn't find perhaps as much rhythm in his jumping as he had done on his chase debut at Utoxeter. I'm not sure Windsor is a track that brings about an awful lot of rhythm, and I'm not sure it's a track that actually suits Nico de Boinville, but he was well on top at the end. The further he went, the better he went. Powerful through the line. He's up now £2 to a mark of 151. They say they're now going to head to the Reynoldstown at Ascot, and then from there on to the Browns Advisory. I think the Reynoldstown would look like a very good opportunity for him. I don't think that will be a deep race. I think he'll come up short in the Browns Advisory, but already I'm thinking ahead to next season. And if they can keep his handicap mark around about this level, not get too much of a hefty rise, I do think a race like the Hennessy around Newbury 3 miles would really suit this horse as a second season novice chaser. So Jinko Blue is going into my tracker, and he'll stay in there for a while. I won't be in a rush to pull him out, even if he doesn't shape up all that well at the Cheltenham Festival. Also running well at Windsor on that Sunday, but without winning, was Zipko for John Joe O'Neill, Keelan Woods in the saddle. He has to be settled towards the rear of the field in his races, as he was when winning at Newbury on his penultimate start. That was his first start after a wind-up. He won that very nicely indeed. He went up £8. Still ran well, though, I felt, at Windsor. Perhaps not a track that suits horses that are held up towards the rear of the field. Certainly the principles in that 3-mile handicap hurdle won by Tight Discovery were ridden prominently, but he finished a really good effect, suggesting that this new mark of 131 up £2, finishing third, probably isn't beyond him on a more conventional track. With a stiff finish, 3 miles, clearly has the stamina for that, and he's a horse that's pretty hard to catch right, but John O'Neill seems to have him in a good vein of form at the moment, so Zipko, certainly a horse I'd be keen to keep on side. Probably the most impressive winner from the last 7 days was the Laura Morgan trained Kepler's Law. He won in emphatic style at Leicester Novice Hurdle, beating Barlavento, who's rated 117, by 30 lengths. I think there's every chance Barlavento didn't give his running, and he certainly wasn't hard pressed once it was clear that he couldn't win. Sean Bowen didn't give him a hard time, but Kepler's Law was really impressive under Adam Wedge, went right away in the closing stages. Clearly coped very well with the testing ground on this stiff Leicester hurdles track, but it isn't just a flash in the pan. It's not just a one single piece of form. His debut form behind Mr. Megget, beaten 8 lengths by him. He's a decent horse. They felt that he perhaps didn't get things his own way there, Kepler's Law. That was a decent piece of form. He's clearly well suited by testing conditions, but he will go on better ground. He's up now to a mark of 128, up that £12. Laura Morgan has said that he'll be raced sparingly this year. They're already thinking ahead to when he goes over fences, but I do think, given that he liked this testing ground, maybe the EBF final at Sandown, right-handed on testing ground, would suit this horse down to the ground. So he'll certainly be on my radar for that race, and certainly a horse to keep on side heading into novice chases next season. I mentioned earlier when talking about Venetia Williams that she's starting to enjoy a slight upturn in the form of her yard, and Hunter's Legend was a good winner over 2 miles 6 furlongs at Leicester last week, again drawing right away in the closing stages, clearly suited by conditions. That was his second win at the course. He'd previously won off an £8 lower mark over 2 mile 4. He's up now another £5 to a mark of 123. That is going to demand more, but he clearly likes this track, goes well there. He's run slightly poorer at other tracks, so he could be a Leicester specialist if they can find a similar race with similar conditions. I don't think this marker 123 is necessarily going to stop him, particularly now that Venetia Williams is coming back into a bit of form. A horse that I was pretty excited about for each of the last 2 seasons, and mentioned him in the pre-season preview, was Salt Rock, trained by Kim Bailey, and he's been pretty disappointed in the last 2 seasons. He only made 1 appearance on each of those occasions, clearly been difficult to train. But since going over fences in handicap company, he's 2 from 2. He won at Hereford over 2 miles on his debut. His latest win came over 2 mile 3 at Doncaster. He got there very nicely, jumping the second last, travelled well into contention, didn't make a great job of the last fence, and that allowed the runner-up to close, but he was still well on top at the death. He's the sort of horse that I think will progress with time. He'll stay much further. I actually saw him win his point-to-point debut at Charlton Hawthorn. Really impressive looking horse. Stayed very well on that occasion. And I was excited to see what he could do. Clearly been difficult to train, but since going over fences, he's looked rejuvenated. He's up now to a mark of 121, up £6 for that Doncaster win. But like I said, if you go up and trip with him, I think there's plenty more to come for this progressive horse, particularly if they can keep him sound and healthy. Sound and healthy leads us quite nicely into Vicenzio, trained by Sam Thomas. Sam has spoken quite openly in the last couple of seasons that he often struggles to keep his horses healthy through the depths of the winter, given the makeup of his yard. When the rain comes, it can cause him a few bits of bother, but he's kept in good order this year. Vicenzio won a nice 2 mile handicap chase at Sandown on Friday. He jumps really well, as he has done on both of his chase starts. He was runner-up to Caliph de Burley at Cheltenham on his last start. I think that pays a handsome compliment to Paul Nicholls' horse, and he was well on top at the death at Sandown, stayed really well on testing ground, jumped much the best of the runners in the field. I think he'll stay further in time. 2 mile 4 might bring about a bit more improvement. I do think there are a little bit of cut in the ground is important to this horse, so come the Spring Festival, the novice chase at the now was handicap chase at Cheltenham would look the logical target, but if the ground was lively there, he might just lack a little bit of tactical speed. But he's a horse that's going to go into my tracker, and I'll certainly keep him in there because he could be the type of horse that could shape up well in the likes of the Paddy Power Gold Cup, the December Gold Cup, over those intermediate trips at Cheltenham in big handicap fields next year, given that he's a very nice jumper of a fence. Away from Cheltenham at the weekend, I was really pleased to see Doc Pick Me win the Great Yorkshire Chase for trainer Richard Hobson, a trainer I've got some affiliation with, given that he trains my horses. And he was pretty confident going into the race that he had this horse in good form. He finished runner-up at this track on his previous start. On this occasion, ridden by Charlie Maggs, claiming 5. He was maybe going to come off second best to Walking on Air, who departed at the last fence when looking like he was going to go on to win. But speaking to Richard afterwards, he was pretty adamant that Doc Pick Me is a pretty gritty battler, and he certainly didn't feel that he was completely done with jumping the last fence. Regardless, they got their little bit of luck. He's up £4 now to a mark of 133, but Richard has used conditional jockeys with their claim really well this season, and he's used Callum Pritchard very well. He's a £7 claimer. Charlie Maggs claiming 5 here. If Richard can find a £7 claimer back on Doc Pick Me around Doncaster, which is a track that clearly suits him, this new mark of 133 might yet prove workable, for all that it's a career high mark for Doc Pick Me. Then the final two horses to talk about going up in the handicap, both trained by the same training partnership of Oliver Greenall and Josh Guerrero, and finished first and second in the novice handicap chase at Cheltenham. Jaguar and Billy the Real Big Red. Jaguar stayed really well up the hill to get the better of his stablemate. He jumped pretty well throughout. He's up £7 now, though, to a mark of 139. They've said that both these horses will look like being aimed at the novice handicap chase at the Cheltenham Festival. I think 139 over 2 mile 4 might just prove a little bit too much for Jaguar. He has now, though, got the requisite 4 runs to give him entitlement to an entry in the ultimate chase over 3 miles at the festival. I think that would perhaps be more appealing. He looks to me like a horse that will stay well. He jumps nicely, doesn't do anything particularly quick, but does look like he has a touch of class. So I'd be interested in him. He'd be on my shortlist for that race. I'm not sure he'd be on my shortlist for the novice handicap chase. And I think the same applies to Billy the Real Big Red. I struggle to see how he could run any better than he did at the weekend. He jumped absolutely impeccably under James Reeve. He never missed a beat, just got collared up the running by a stronger stayer. They've said that he'll go towards the novice handicap chase. I don't think that this new mark of 134 gives him much room for manoeuvre. And you also have to factor in that he got a £6 weight for age allowance on Saturday. He's a 4-year-old turning 5 this year, so they get a weight allowance in chases. That's going to start to whittle down now as we head on into the spring. So he could find himself a fairly poorly handicapped horse in the spring. The horse is going down now, and the first to talk about again comes from Windsor on that Winter Million Sunday, and it's a legal day night for Chris Gordon. He finished 4th in a 2 mile 4 handicap hurdle, was up in the vanguard throughout, was off the bridle some way out, was under pressure from a good distance out, but stuck to his task really well, jumped soundly, rallied into 4th, plugged on. I think he's a horse that will relish a step up in trip or a stiffer test of stamina. He got dropped £1 down to a mark of 116. I thought that was a fairly lenient move by the handicapper. I thought he'd have been perfectly entitled to keep him on the same mark, maybe even bump him up £1, but as it is, he's come down £1. I think that will certainly not harm a legal Danish chance of getting on the scoreboard, particularly if upped in trip to around about 3 miles. Already mentioned Rich Hobson had a good winner with Doc Pick Me on Saturday, but earlier last week he introduced Jupiter de Boers, a French recruit, for his UK debut at Warwick. Warwick is a track that takes a fair bit of jumping, particularly if you haven't seen regulation UK fences before. Given the weather, I know Richard hadn't been able to get a huge amount of schooling into him, so he was really pleased with the way he jumped. He barely missed a fence. He was given a patient ride by Dylan Johnston and rallied into a strong finishing 3rd in a race won by Leader in the Park, who's a decent yardstick. He did race off a lowly mark there of 108, but the handicapper's dropped him down to 106, which I thought was a perfectly fair move on behalf of the handicapper. This is the sort of horse that Rich does very well with given time, builds them up slowly over handicap chase fences and up in distance. I think Jupiter de Boers is a horse that should certainly go into your tracker, so if not for the short term, certainly for the long term. And then just one horse going up in the handicap, and that's the Ian Jardine trained Dunnet Head. He finished a far better effect over fences on his latest start, over 2 miles at Ayr, and that was a big step back in the right direction. He made a good seasonal reappearance over hurdles at Carlisle, 2 mile 4, only narrowly touched off a mark of 107. He then went over fences up to 2 mile 6. He didn't appear to stay the trip on that occasion, didn't jump all that well either. They reverted back to hurdles, again over 2 mile 6, and I think that categorically proved this is a horse that doesn't stay that far. They dropped him back to 2 miles here. That was probably a little bit sharp, but I do think, given he's now down £1 to a mark of 107, that mark that he ran very well off on his seasonal return, if they go to a 2 mile 4 trip over fences, should allow him to stay a little bit better jumping fences and jumping hurdles. I think Dunnet Head is a horse that's certainly got a race in him this season. And to finish with one non-mover, and again for the Greenall and Guerrero training partnership, Iroko, who ran in that 2 mile 4 handicap chase. Probably hasn't passed you by that jockey John Joe O'Neill was asked to explain his riding of Iroko through that race. The reason given to the stewards was he said that having fallen on his previous start, it was a prerequisite of that run to build his confidence back up, and the explanation was noted by the stewards. I'm not sure I'd have been quite so accepting of that, because I thought the ride was at odds of the explanation, in that if you're trying to give a horse a boost his confidence over fences, having had a fall, the last thing you want to do is to put them into pockets of runners and not give them a fair sight of the fence. And that happened on more than one occasion with Iroko. He was a strong finishing fourth, rallying well up the hill, and I'm just not sure that he was fully on his merits here. The handicapper has bought it as well. He's left him on an unchanged mark of 152. I think he'd have been perfectly entitled to have bumped him up, given that we know this horse is being aimed towards the Grand National. Whether he's a 4 mile and a quarter horse, I'm not quite so sure, and he certainly doesn't jump particularly fluently at times, which for all the fact that the fences are easier at Aintree these days, you still need to get into a jumping rhythm. So I'm not sure he's on my radar for the Grand National, but I do think once the weights are announced, you'll see this horse putting his best foot forward. So he certainly would be on my radar for a 3 mile handicap chase in the spring. That's it for another episode of Miller's Movers. Plenty covered this week. And remember, if you like my anti-post selection double of Constitution Hill and John Bond in the Champion Hurdle and the Champion Chase boosted to 5-1, the link to that bet will be in the description below this video. It'll be held for a few days after publication of the video, so do avail yourself to that. But remember to gamble responsibly. I'll be back same time next week. In the meantime, enjoy your weeks of racing.